By the time I reached Ely, the last gas station on the highway was already shutting down. The clerk locked the door behind me, nodded toward the dark forest beyond the parking lot, and said, "If you're headed into the Boundary Waters tonight, don't stop for anyone on the portage trails." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He didn't laugh back. Outside, the pines were bending in the wind, and somewhere beyond them, hundreds of miles of water and forest stretched across the Minnesota borderlands into Canada. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is one of the largest roadless regions in the United States, a maze of lakes, islands, bogs, and ancient forest where GPS signals fade and sound travels strangely over water. I had come to film a documentary about traditional hunting and trapping practices among Ojibwe communities. My local contact, a man named Raymond Defoe, had agreed to guide me for a week. He was waiting at the outfitter's dock when I arrived, standing beside a battered cedar strip canoe with a wool blanket folded over one shoulder. He looked to be in his 60s, lean and weathered, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The first thing he asked was not who I was or how long I planned to stay. He asked whether I had ever spent a night alone in the Boundary Waters. When I told him no, he studied me for a moment and said, "Then you should know this place doesn't always behave like the maps say it does." We paddled north under a low ceiling of clouds. The water was black and smooth as polished stone. Raymond moved the canoe almost silently, dipping his paddle with practiced precision while I struggled to keep rhythm. For hours we passed granite shorelines, jack pine ridges, and narrow channels where the wind funneled between cliffs. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No road noise, no aircraft, no distant machinery, just water dripping from paddles and the occasional call of a loon echoing across the lake. Near dusk we reached a small island campsite. Raymond gathered wood while I set up my camera gear. When the fire was burning, I asked him about the warning from the gas station. He fed another stick into the flames and said, "People around here tell stories. Some are old, some are foolish. But there's one story hunters don't like to tell unless they have to." He looked into the fire for a long moment before continuing. "My grandfather called it the thing that follows the edges. Not a spirit exactly. Not an animal either. Something that stays where the land and water meet." I assumed he was describing a piece of folklore, the kind of tale every wilderness region develops over generations. I asked if it had a name. Raymond shook his head. "Names have power. Better not to give it one." Then he added, almost casually, "If you hear someone calling from the shore after dark, don't answer." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was atmosphere, just an experienced woodsman testing a city visitor. Still, that night I found it difficult to sleep. The wind died completely after midnight. The lake became unnaturally still. I lay in my tent listening to the faint hiss of dying embers from the fire pit and the occasional splash of fish. Sometime later I heard what sounded like a voice far out on the water. It was too distant to understand, but it had the cadence of a person calling for attention. I sat up and listened. The voice came again, carried across the lake, thin and stretched by distance. "Hey." Then nothing. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Moonlight silvered the water. Raymond was sitting by the fire, awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He didn't turn around. "Yes," he said. "Go back." The next morning he acted as though nothing unusual had happened. We packed camp and continued north through a chain of lakes connected by portages. Along one muddy trail I noticed tracks that looked almost human but too long and narrow, with deep impressions in the toes. Raymond crouched beside them for several seconds. "Not moose," he said quietly. "Not bear." I asked what he thought made them. "Something that walks where it shouldn't." He stood and shouldered the canoe. "Keep moving." The forest around us seemed to absorb sound. Even the squirrels had gone quiet. Halfway through the portage I became aware of another noise, footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate, matching our pace. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned and saw only trees, ferns, and shadows. Raymond kept walking. "Don't look for it," he called back. "That's how people get turned around." We reached a larger lake by afternoon. Clouds had thickened and the air smelled of rain. While I filmed Raymond checking fishing nets near a rocky point, I noticed movement on the opposite shore. At first I thought it was a black bear standing among the cedars. Then it straightened. The figure was tall, far taller than a man, and unnaturally thin, with arms that hung almost to its knees. It stood motionless between two trees. I raised the camera and zoomed in, but a gust of rain swept across the lens, and when I looked again the figure was gone. "Raymond," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "someone's over there." He followed my gaze but did not appear surprised. "No," he said. "No one camps on that shore." He pulled the net into the canoe with quick, efficient movements. "We're leaving." The storm hit before we reached the next campsite. Wind drove sheets of rain across the lake, and waves slapped against the canoe. We made landfall on a narrow peninsula and dragged the canoe above the waterline. Thunder rolled across the forest. As we secured the tarp, Raymond finally spoke. "You saw something, didn't you?" I nodded. "Describe it." I told him about the height, the long arms, the way it stood perfectly still. His expression hardened. "My grandfather saw the same thing in 1947. He was checking trap lines near Knife Lake. Said it watched him from the trees for almost an hour and never blinked." Rain hammered the tarp overhead. "What was it?" I asked. Raymond stared into the storm. He believed it was something that learned to imitate us but never became human. That night the storm passed, leaving the forest dripping and cold. We sat under the tarp drinking coffee while fog crept across the lake. Raymond spoke more freely than before. He told me that elders in his community warned hunters not to travel alone during certain weeks of autumn when the nights grow long and the loons stop calling. They believed there were places in the boundary waters where the boundary between worlds was thin. Most people dismissed the stories as superstition, but every few years someone disappeared, a fisherman who never returned from a solo trip, a hunter whose canoe was found drifting empty, a trapper whose tracks simply ended at the shoreline. Official reports blamed accidents, exposure, drowning. "Sometimes that's true," Raymond said. "But not always." Around midnight I heard footsteps circling the campsite. Soft, careful, almost barefoot. They stopped near my tent. I could hear breathing on the other side of the fabric. My hand closed around the flashlight, but before I could switch it on, Raymond spoke from somewhere in the darkness. "Go away." The breathing stopped. For several seconds there was only the sound of dripping trees. Then came a voice that made every hair on my neck stand up. It sounded exactly like me. "Raymond," it said softly, "help me." The imitation was nearly perfect, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, as if the words had been learned phonetically. Raymond answered immediately. "That is not him." The voice repeated, "Help me." Closer this time. I clicked on the flashlight and the beam caught nothing but wet brush and tree trunks. The footsteps retreated into the forest with startling speed. I emerged from the tent, shaking. Raymond was standing with a rifle in his hands. "Now you understand why I told you not to answer voices," he said. I barely slept. At dawn we found fresh tracks around the campsite. They circled both tents and led to the water's edge, where they vanished. The impressions were long, narrow, and deeply pressed into the mud, as though whatever made them was heavier than it looked. I filmed them while Raymond watched the tree line. "We're changing our route," he said. "There's a place I need to show you." We broke camp quickly and paddled through a series of narrow channels choked with reeds. The weather had turned strangely warm. Dragonflies skimmed the surface of the water, and the forest smelled of cedar and decay. After several hours we entered a secluded bay surrounded by steep rock walls. At the far end stood a cliff stained black by mineral runoff. Raymond pointed to a dark opening near the base. That cave wasn't on the old maps, he said. My grandfather found it after he saw the thing in 1947. He looked at me carefully. He believed it was where it went during the day. As we approached the shore, I noticed something carved into the rock around the cave entrance, faded symbols cut deep into the stone, weathered by decades of rain. Some resembled traditional Ojibwe motifs, others looked older and unfamiliar. The air felt colder near the cliff, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Raymond stepped out of the canoe first and rested his hand on the rifle. Whatever happens, he said, if you hear your own voice coming from inside that cave, don't answer it. Then he started toward the darkness, and I followed, with the feeling that the boundary waters had been leading us here from the moment we first paddled into its silent, black water. The darkness inside the cave seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight instead of reflecting it. The moment Raymond and I crossed the entrance, the sounds of the outside world vanished. The wind disappeared. The distant calls of birds disappeared. Even the gentle movement of water against the shoreline outside seemed to fade into nothing. It felt as though the cave existed separately from the rest of the boundary waters. Every step echoed strangely. The floor was uneven stone covered with damp patches of moss. The deeper we moved, the colder the air became. My breath became visible. Raymond walked ahead without hesitation, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. Ancient carvings appeared everywhere. Some resembled traditional Ojibwe symbols, while others looked far older and far less familiar. Long spiral patterns covered sections of the rock. Strange human-like figures with elongated limbs appeared repeatedly throughout the chamber. Many of them seemed to be standing beside water. Others appeared to be watching canoes. One image in particular caught my attention. It showed a tall figure standing among trees while smaller human figures fled in different directions. The figure's arms reached nearly to the ground. The resemblance to what I had seen across the lake was impossible to ignore. Raymond stopped when he noticed me staring at it. My grandfather showed me this drawing when I was 17, he said quietly. He believed the people who made these carvings were trying to leave a warning. I asked who created them. Raymond shook his head. Nobody knows. We continued deeper. The tunnel narrowed until we were forced to move single file. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The air carried a faint odor I could not identify. It smelled old, almost like wet earth mixed with something animal. After several minutes, the passage opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight swept across the room and immediately froze on dozens of markings scratched into the stone floor. At first they looked random. Then I realized they formed circles. Hundreds of circles. Some large. Some small. They overlapped each other across the entire chamber. What are those? I whispered. Raymond stared at them with visible discomfort. Tracks, he answered. Old tracks. Before I could ask another question, a sound echoed somewhere deeper inside the cave. It sounded like a footstep. Then another. Then silence. Every muscle in my body tightened. Raymond raised his rifle. The chamber fell completely still. We listened for nearly 30 seconds. Nothing. Finally Raymond lowered the weapon. We're leaving, he said. Right now. We turned toward the entrance. That was when the voice spoke. Raymond. The sound came from somewhere behind us. My heart nearly stopped. The voice was perfect. It sounded exactly like Raymond himself. Same tone. Same accent. Same age. It even carried the slight roughness in his throat. Raymond, it repeated. Wait. I looked at him. His face had gone pale. Without turning around he said, keep walking. The voice came again. Closer this time. You left me here. Raymond grabbed my arm and practically dragged me toward the tunnel. We moved quickly through the narrow passage. Behind us the voice continued speaking. At first it sounded like Raymond. Then it changed. Suddenly it sounded exactly like me. Help. The word echoed through the darkness. Help me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around. The imitation was flawless. It sounded terrified. Injured. Human. Yet Raymond kept pulling me forward. Don't look back, he snapped. The voice followed us all the way to the cave entrance. Only when sunlight became visible ahead did the sounds finally stop. We emerged onto the shoreline breathing hard. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Raymond stared at the cave entrance as though expecting something to emerge. Nothing did. The opening remained dark and silent. Eventually we returned to the canoe. While paddling away, Raymond finally explained why he had brought me there. His grandfather had entered that same cave in 1947 after tracking a strange figure along the shoreline. He had discovered similar carvings and heard voices mimicking members of his hunting party. According to him, the thing living there did not simply imitate sounds. It studied people. It learned them. It collected pieces of them. Raymond believed the creature had been watching us since the first night we entered the boundary waters. That evening we camped on a small island several miles away. Neither of us mentioned the cave again. Yet the atmosphere felt different. The wilderness no longer seemed peaceful. Every shadow between the trees appeared deeper than before. Every sound seemed suspicious. Even the familiar call of loons across the lake carried an unsettling quality. Around midnight I woke to complete silence. No wind. No insects. No movement. The kind of silence that feels unnatural. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. Then I heard something moving outside the tent. Slow footsteps. Deliberate footsteps. Circling the campsite. The sound continued for several minutes. I reached for my flashlight. Before I could turn it on, Raymond's voice came from outside. Stay inside. I relaxed slightly. Then I realized something. Raymond's tent was on the opposite side of camp. The voice had come from only a few feet away. A terrible feeling settled into my stomach. Raymond? I called. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence returned. Then the voice spoke again. Come outside. Every hair on my body stood up. It sounded exactly like Raymond. Yet something about the cadence felt wrong. The pauses were slightly too long. The words felt rehearsed. Artificial. Come outside, it repeated. You need to see this. I remained motionless. Several seconds passed. Then another voice answered from across camp. The real Raymond. Don't move. The fake voice instantly fell silent. For nearly a minute nobody spoke. Then a branch snapped somewhere near the shoreline. Another followed. Heavy footsteps retreated into the darkness. By dawn we discovered fresh tracks surrounding the tents. The same elongated impressions we had seen before. Only now there were dozens of them. They formed a complete circle around the campsite. Raymond studied them quietly before saying something that chilled me more than anything else he had told me so far. It's getting closer. We packed camp immediately. Our plan was simple. Reach the nearest ranger station before nightfall. The weather remained clear as we paddled south through interconnected lakes. For several hours nothing unusual happened. The forest looked normal again. Sunlight sparkled on the water. Eagles soared overhead. Part of me began convincing myself that fear had distorted my perception. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the voices had echoes. Maybe the tracks belonged to an unusual animal. Maybe the cave stories were exaggerated local legends. Then we reached a narrow channel connecting two lakes. Raymond stopped paddling. His eyes locked on something ahead. I followed his gaze. Standing on the shoreline was a man. At least I thought it was a man. The figure stood completely motionless among the trees. Even from a distance I recognized the unnatural height. The long arms. The impossible stillness. Unlike previous sightings, this one did not disappear. It simply watched us. Neither Raymond nor I spoke. We drifted silently in the canoe. After nearly 20 seconds, the figure slowly stepped behind a tree. When it emerged from the other side, it looked different. Smaller. Human-sized. The proportions had changed. It now resembled an ordinary person standing in the forest. Yet something remained terribly wrong. It still did not move naturally.